You are listening to The Soul's Quiet Call, written by Akumah and voiceover by Sara.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Chapter 19, The First Bloom of Hope. The sun had begun to set, casting a golden light over Meera's flower shop as the day slowly ebbed into evening. The warmth of the afternoon clung to the air, a stark contrast to the quiet stillness that had settled between her and Aarav in recent weeks. There was a softness in the atmosphere now, something that had been absent when their paths had first crossed. It was the kind of quiet that came after a storm, when the world seemed to breathe a little easier, a little slower. Aarav stood by the door, watching Meera as she carefully arranged a fresh batch of flowers, roses, lavender, and jasmine, their vibrant colors filling the small shop. His heart felt lighter now, less burdened by the weight of the past. He had come to understand that healing didn't happen in grand gestures or rushed decisions. It was a slow process, one that could only begin when both people were ready to face what had kept them apart. Meera, for her part, had started to show a new strength, a quiet resolve that radiated from her with every step she took. She had learned to set aside her gift when it came to him, to stop relying on it to understand the man standing before her. She wanted to know him as he was, without the veil of her abilities. And though it was difficult at times, she had come to realize that love, true love, required more than just insight into someone's heart. It required trust, patience, and the willingness to embrace uncertainty. She smiled softly to herself as she finished her arrangement, placing the final sprig of jasmine into the vase. It was a small, simple gesture, but in that moment, it felt like the most meaningful one she had ever made. The flowers were a reflection of her own growth, delicate yet resilient, beautiful in their imperfection. Aarav watched her with quiet admiration, the ache in his chest slowly unraveling. It wasn't that he had suddenly figured everything out. He still carried the weight of his past, still wrestled with the fears that had once held him captive. But with Meera, there was something different. She had given him the space to be himself, to be flawed and broken, and yet, she never judged him. She never asked for more than he could give, but she always encouraged him to take another step forward. "You're quiet tonight," Meera said, her voice soft but knowing. She turned to face him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of what he was feeling. "Is everything all right?" Aarav took a deep breath, letting the silence linger for a moment longer before he spoke. "I'm learning to be," he said quietly, his gaze steady. "To be all right with the way things are. To be all right with me." Meera's heart caught in her chest at his words. There was something profoundly vulnerable in the way he spoke, something that moved her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She stepped closer, her eyes softening. "I'm glad to hear that." Aarav met her gaze, his eyes filled with a depth she had only begun to understand. "And I'm glad you're here. I don't know what I would have done without you." There was no grand declaration, no sweeping promises. Just a quiet, simple truth that spoke volumes. Meera smiled, a small but genuine smile that lit up her face. "I'm here, Aarav. Always." He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and for the first time in weeks, Meera didn't feel the pull of uncertainty or doubt. She simply felt the warmth of his presence, the quiet understanding that had grown between them. Aarav hesitated for a moment, as though contemplating something. Then, without a word, he reached down and pulled out a small bouquet of flowers from behind his back. The blooms were simple, wildflowers, daisy-like in their fragility, but their colors were soft and vibrant, a mixture of purples, pinks, and whites. He held them out to her, his expression open, unguarded. Meera's breath caught in her throat. She looked at the bouquet for a moment, the weight of the gesture sinking in. It wasn't grand or elaborate. It wasn't something she could see with her gift. It was simply a gift from his heart, a small piece of himself offered in the most honest way he could. Her hand trembled slightly as she took the flowers from him. Aarav, these are beautiful, she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. But why? He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. Because I want to show you that I'm here. That I'm ready. Not just to move forward with you, but to move forward with myself. I know it's not perfect, but it's a start. A quiet smile tugged at the corners of Meera's lips. There was no grand speech, no elaborate promises. Just a simple, beautiful gesture that spoke volumes. It was everything she had hoped for, everything she had wanted to hear, without needing him to say it. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Aarav nodded, his gaze softening. I've learned that sometimes, it's the small things that matter the most. They stood there for a long moment, both of them simply existing in the space they had created together. The flowers in her hands felt like more than just petals and stems. They felt like a symbol of the slow, steady bloom of hope that had begun to take root between them. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was real. I've been thinking, Meera said after a while, her voice steady. About us. About everything we've been through. Aarav raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. What about it? I've been so focused on understanding everything, on seeing everything clearly, she said. But I've realized that love, our love, can't be controlled like that. It can't be seen all at once. Sometimes, you just have to let it unfold, to let it grow in its own time. Aarav's heart thudded in his chest at her words. He had spent so much of his life trying to control everything, trying to hold on to a version of himself that no longer fit. But now, with Meera, he was beginning to understand that love wasn't something that could be figured out or fixed. It was something that simply existed, in its own time, its own rhythm. I think you're right, he said quietly. It's not about knowing everything. It's about trusting each other to figure it out, together. Meera smiled, a soft, contented smile that made his heart ache in the best possible way. I think we're starting to understand that. Aarav reached for her hand, the simple contact sending a jolt of warmth through both of them. He held it gently, as though afraid that anything more might break the fragile connection they had built. But at that moment, Meera didn't need anything more. The quiet trust between them was enough. For the first time in a long while, they both felt a sense of peace, a sense of hope. The storm of their pasts had passed, and in its wake, something new was beginning to bloom. And though they both knew the road ahead would still have its challenges, they also knew that they would face it together. Not as two people trying to fix each other, but as two individuals who had chosen to walk side by side, hand in hand, through whatever came next. The first bloom of hope had begun to unfurl, and in that moment, it was enough.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Refer to the channel playlist for a better experience and close your eyes to let your imagination run wild. Subscribe.